Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm just taking a few moments to let you know that this clip that you will see after this introduction is from one of my online classes, and I've decided to edit them so that more people can benefit from these lectures that I deliver pretty much every week. So enjoy and let me know what you think about it. Thank you so much. So, as people are coming in, we will be talking about three texts today. So, Césaire's The Tempest, and then Chinweizu and Ngugi Thiong'O. So, these are some of uh, these are the three, and as you can already see, we are moving into different ways of looking at questions of culture, colonialism, racism by different scholars. And just for your information, next week, then we'll be discussing two poems by Pibotic and a short story by Bessie Head. So those are also two different writers from different parts of Africa. Most of my course is pretty Africa heavy, and there is an intention behind it. So, as always, feel free to ask any questions. And yeah, this election would be really interesting for a lot of reasons. Okay, so I just wanted to give you some introduction to Césaire. Okay, so Césaire was also from Martinique, just like Fanon, and was a prominent figure in France in the Negritude movement, which was started by scholars of African descent, and they were the ones who believed in larger African identity, cultural and social. They also had their own journal in the 60s. And then Césaire eventually becomes the education minister of Martinique. And he was Fanon's senior and very prominent in the movement for the African or for Black rights. And this play, A Tempest, of course, is a rewriting of Shakespeare's The Tempest. Engagement and a wedding, and then good memory. So keep in mind, it is kind of the same as the Heart of Darkness theme, right? Here is a native island, and these two Europeans come to it. That is Prospero, former Duke of Milan, and his daughter Miranda. And the play is staged from the point of view of the Europeans, right? Just like Heart of Darkness was staged from the point of view of the Europeans, even though Heart of Darkness is written centuries later, the theme is the same. And then the two figures of Caliban and Ariel. Now, Caliban as a character in Shakespeare's play was the original inhabitant of the island. His mother, Sycorax, owned the island. Ariel was Sycorax's servant, and she gets mad at him and imprisons him in a tree trunk. So when Prospero comes, he's a powerful wizard as well. He has his book of magic. And he frees Ariel from the tree with a promise that if Ariel serves him loyally for a certain period, in the end, Prospero will free Ariel and let him live, let him inherit the island. So the Prospero-Ariel relationship is kind of a contractual relationship. Whereas Prospero-Caliban relationship is a relationship of brute force. Caliban constantly keeps agitating against Prospero, right? And Prospero keeps him under control through Ariel's power, because Ariel is the one who punishes Caliban every time Caliban transgresses. But Caliban is constantly kept in force, in thrall of Prospero's power. Now, towards the end of the play, Prospero decides he's done. He breaks his magician's staff and he returns to Milan, right? And we are led to believe that Ariel and Caliban have inherited the island. Now, in Césaire's rewriting of the play, you read the last act of the play. So what you get then is, first of all, the idea that Prospero never leaves in this play. Prospero is still living on the island. He's gone senile. He sees things. He doesn't make sense, right? But he's there sitting by his cave. Whereas Caliban is still young and youthful and is running around and is vigorous and all. So that's the juxtaposition that Cesaire creates. And symbolically, what we can also read into it is that what he's also maybe suggesting is that, look, the natives stay youthful and would continue fighting for their freedom, but the colonizers actually never leave. It needs to be really free. This order of aerials needs to be replaced by by a system in which people have more of a say and more of a participation in power. Now, Chinweizu has an interesting story because he went to SUNY Buffalo. That's where he got his PhD. But when he was working on his PhD in history, he had quite a few differences of opinions with his director. And he goes to his dissertation defense and just picks up his dissertation and walks off. He's like, no, I'm not going to defend it. Then he goes and publishes his book with Random House. And of course, the book becomes a huge bestseller, but also a huge topic of scholarly debate. And I think it was called The West and the Rest. That was the original title. And so he goes back to Buffalo like after about a year and basically just gives them the book and says, give me my PhD. And they eventually give him his PhD. He was also very active in the Black rights movement, in the Black arts movement around Harlem and elsewhere, and is heavily influenced by that. And so when you read his essay, you will see that what he believes in is in creating a kind of a purist African culture, right? African cultures in different African nation states that retrieve African histories, African stories, African languages. And while doing so, they also erase the European influences and the Arab influences so that they can have a purely African cultural identity. Now, what he doesn't want that identity to be is pre-capitalistic or prehistoric. What he's saying is, let's take the knowledge of our own true African heritage, but reshape it within modernity, with industrial capital, with the modern knowledge. And he sees that as a cultural project, right? And we can talk about that a little more if you have questions. And then we go to Ngugi Thiong'O, who is from Kenya, right? Now, Ngugi's actual birth name was James Ngugi, right? And he was raised a Christian. But then, towards the middle of his life, he was already a successful writer of novels, and he wrote in English. He decides that he was going to take up his African identity. So he changes his name from James Ngugi to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, which is his Gikuyu name. Now, Gikuyu is one of the 5 major languages in Kenya and a region in Kenya. And then he decides, he's a socialist, so his early works, other than his novels, are also native plays, like community plays. And they do community theater where members of community come together, write a play and stage it. And these plays are usually political. They critique the power within the Kenyan nation state. And he gets in trouble for it and actually is imprisoned. And a kind of an apocryphal story is that he wrote Devil on the Cross, is one of his major novels, on toilet paper in prison and then smuggled it out. Now, that was the first book he writes in Gikuyu. And his idea is that for African nation states to really develop their own native cultures, the African writers must start writing in their own languages. Because what his idea is that any culture that defines itself, every living culture must have a living culture written culture, arts culture to rely on. And since the tragedy in Africa was that since most African cultures were oral, when they are colonized, within 1 or 2 generations, that oral tradition is lost, right? Because young people go to the British school, go to the government school, learn English, move on. So that chain of narration is broken. So what his idea is that instead of just having this European language or European identities, we, the African writers, should start writing in our native languages so that we can build a body of literature in our native languages that people can read, people can understand, and stay in touch with their own culture. So the essay that you read, in that he is kind of debating that issue, but also the major issue of role of language and power, right? What role do European languages play, and how imperial that role is, right? Because the example that he uses is that any European or American scholar, can claim to be a scholar on Kenya or Nigeria without knowing a single regional language or national language. But if someone from Africa comes along and says, hey, I'm an Americanist, I want to apply for a job, but I've only read American literature in Swahili or in Yoruba, people won't take that seriously because languages have these gradations, right? And what he's trying to say is that maybe at a certain level, all languages should enjoy a certain kind of privilege so that all languages can exist in the world and create their own works of art. That's why he uses word is a garden with 1,000 flowers to bloom. And that thing has real life implications for scholars, especially, and writers. I mean, I once knew a scholar who was a scholar on Iran and had published a book with Cambridge University Press on the 1960s Iranian Revolution, not revolution, but the fall of the Mossadegh regime and its replacement by Shah of Iran. And, I asked her if she knew Farsi, and she was like, no, I don't speak Farsi. But she could claim scholarship on Iran without knowing the main language in which Iranian archive is written, right? But on the other hand, if I come from Pakistan and I say, I'm a 20th century American expert, but I've only read it in Urdu, no one will take me seriously. So it's that inequality, global and local, that he's trying to address and talk about. So these are the three authors. Now I'm hoping that you're making the connections, that as we read them, we are developing a repertoire of thinking about Africa, but also thinking about the role of language, politics behind it. Because as we read further, that's how I've designed this course, is that as we read further, if we read carefully enough, by the time you reach the end of the course, you will have developed kind of a nuanced mode of thinking questions of culture. System does to people in terms of how they think about their culture. And I'm glad you made that connection, because here is another thing that Ngugi writes about in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, right? He talks about the colonial educational system itself, right? And what he says is that, okay, just imagine that a little kid leaves his or her village, right, which is an intact cultural community, and goes to a colonial school. And when you go to a colonial school, what the school system insisted was that you will not speak any of your own languages. Those were called dialects. So the students were forbidden to speak in their own native languages. They were required to speak in English. And then in certain schools, the teacher would give any first student that a teacher encountered in a class, they will give him a little token. And they would say, pass it on to the first kid that you hear speaking Gikuyu or Yoruba or Kaswali, right? So by the end of the class day, the teacher will ask who has the token, right? And a kid would give it to him. And then he would say, who gave it to you? And through the chain of narration, all the 10 or 14 kids through whose hands the token had passed would be lined up because they were the ones who had used the native language. And then they would be publicly humiliated for using Yoruba or Gikuyu. So what Ngugi then argues is that not only were the students learning that this English that we are learning is the language of power, and if we master it, we will be able to get jobs and whatever else, but they were also learning that their own languages are inferior and it's bad to speak about them. And then as they progress in the educational system, as their thoughts become more Europeanized, they also develop the same disdain for their own native culture, just like the Europeans had, right? And that means they develop a self-view, which automatically assumes that they are inferior. And that is what Caliban is talking about here, that this idea that you have given me, that I'm primitive. And that always happens in colonialism, where certain people already internalize this idea as scientific or true because the comparison is wrong, but they start believing that they are less advanced and less developed. I still remember this. Before I came to America, I used to read The Economist and the New York Times, the Newsweek and Times, and they always have a table at the end which was called the developmental index, and they will grade nations in terms of their development, right? And it will always be number of TVs per 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 head, number of electrified houses. Everything in developmental index was connected to commodities or access to scientific equipment, right? There was no index there like number of children taking care of their parents, right? Or number of orphanages run by private institutions. Anything that isn't quantifiable, care, love, and all. So that way, the developed nation already ranked higher. Now think of it if you internalize that, and then you suddenly realize, oh, we're primitive, we are this. So that's one of the biggest challenges of the colonial system and colonial educational system. And then you can apply it to different scenarios as well, right? Not just colonizer. You can see in terms of like in highly traditional families, women are encouraged to not be too expressive about being smart and intelligent, right? And so they develop this persona where even if they know everything, and even if they are smarter than the boys in the families, they tend to hold back. That's another kind of imperial imprint where gender plays a role in defining your public persona or sometimes it is done under proper attitude, sometimes it is internalized under what is permissible or what is ladylike or what is not. But the power dynamic is the same, that you then you maybe sometimes stop believing that maybe you're not all that capable. So it's the same argument here. But you will see when we read the Pibetic poems, that's why they're sequenced like that. I think it was accidental, I didn't intend it, but is that there is one poem from the husband's point of view who has gone on to study in Europe and has internalized the European ways of looking at Africa. And then the other is from the wife's point of view, who have stayed back and maybe in so many ways probably supported him while he was abroad through her labor and work. And it's her lament as to why her husband, who has come back educated, has lost the love for his own family and culture because his aesthetic has been realigned because of his European experience. So, and it becomes a huge problem in colonial countries. I mean, if you go to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, there is a whole hierarchy of color. Like TV ads, well, they still sell like creams that are supposed to lighten your skin tone, right? Where did that come from? Through that colonial experience by like by privileging a certain complexion over another, right? 200 years of colonialism. Yeah, Fair and Lovely. I don't know. I think they changed its name now, but they still sell it, right? You see TV ads in India and Pakistan all the time. And so within the native cultures, of course, these hierarchies existed previously too, but they get heightened, right? If you look at India, the North and South India always had that problem. Okay, now the South Indians, the Dravidians, are the actual native Indians of India, right? The North Indians, most of them came, they were settlers from abroad, right? But they always thought they were superior to the natives. So that divide already existed. And then you imprint on that the Europeanized idea of skin tone and skin color, and a new kind of hybrid prejudice, cultural prejudice emerges. So this concludes this edited version of a live lecture. I'll be back with more, and please keep an eye out for these, and I hope these are useful to you. Thank you so much, and as always, peace and love.